Dom D'Agostino. How you doing, man? Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
I'm doing really well. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. It's been
Appreciate being on.
Yeah, I think it's been over 2 years since I've had you on the podcast.
Yeah, wow, time flies.
Yeah, so
Right,
I know a
yeah.
lot of things have changed. I guess the first thing that I want to jump in with you is, what over the past 2 years in the field of research has been really exciting for you. That's kind of up and coming since the last time we spoke till now.
hmm it's so many things. I can't mention obviously one or even five because there's
Yeah.
at least 10. But I would say, I did get a major grant that I had through the Department of Defense and the Office of Navy Research, stuff that we do for oxygen toxicity, which limits the Navy SEAL divers. I have a renewed grant on that to really expand the science and applications of exogenous ketones for enhancing warfighter performance and safety and
Wow.
resilience. So we are vetting out basically the formulations of exogenous ketones, looking at things like racemic mixtures versus the R,
Yeah.
esters versus salts, medium chain triglycerides, formulating these things to not only look at oxygen toxicity, but look at motor function, look at performance, look at anxiety behavior, looking at many different spectrums, because we don't want to choose an agent that's neuroprotective,
Yeah.
but then it decreases your exercise performance. So we
Gotcha.
want the best of both worlds. So that's a big, big part of what I'm doing. Probably about 2/3 of my time and effort is spent doing that. And last year we did the NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations. I was a crew member. It was a NASA mission, and it's a Mars analog. So NASA has like 14 different analogs. This is the one that actually uses astronauts. It's a little more relevant, I would say. So I was really lucky to get on it, and I was supposed to be part of that mission right now, but because of the hurricanes last year, it got pushed back next year. My wife will actually be a crew member. I'll be a support diver. So that has consumed, since the last time we talked, a big chunk of my time has been really doing human research with IRBs and ethics committees and, working with NASA in different capacities. So that's been another big chunk.
And what do they have you guys doing there? Or what did you guys do down there? What specifically were they testing?
So the NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations, NEMO, they come up with these cute little acronyms for everything. NEMO. We vet out different technologies. We use those technologies inside the habitat, which is a hyperbaric environment, and outside of the habitat is the ocean. Right, we're at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So we will test. We do what astronauts will do. We do EVAs. We go outside, we collect samples, we analyze the composition of those samples, whether it be the coral reef, whether it be like a sponge or something. That we come back to the habitat. We look at our microbiome, we look at our sleep, we look at our strength, we look at our body composition. My wife's a behavioral psychologist, so she analyzes my stress levels and gives me basically cognitive tasks and compares me to the astronauts, which, I mean, they're like super responders. They were selected because they score really high on these kinds of tests. So we collected a lot of data from many different aspects of physiological, psychological, biochemical, and metabolism, right?
Gotcha.
So that's the big thing. So the ketogenic diet is very energy dense. It's neuroprotective. It's has anti-cancer properties. So I have been giving talks at NASA over the years to basically present an idea that the ketogenic diet is about 50% higher energy density, and then it has all these biological properties when you stay in a state of ketosis or do it intermittently. And it's a nutritional strategy that some astronauts are actually already doing. Because they're already doing it, they're working with their flight doctors, to make it maybe an option in, on the astronaut sort of list of foods that they're doing. So I don't try to change the policy of NASA, but what I do is I present to them a nutritional option that I feel personally, and many people, even with the NASA, feels like this should be incorporated into the astronaut kind of nutrition program. So I'm at just like the beginning steps of that, and doing research on metabolism is part of the initial steps that need to be taken to vet out this nutritional strategy or technology, whether it be exogenous ketones for long duration space flight.
Gotcha.
Mission to Mars, that kind of thing.
Yeah, going back to exogenous ketones with the Navy SEALs, you said you're working on different formulations to find out what's most optimal, specifically for Navy SEALs and brain toxicity. Could that be applied to your average person? And I guess that's what you guys are testing with exercise performance and body composition, these other things, to find out, is there one formula that's like great for everybody, or do you think it has to be tweaked depending on the situation, whether you're trying to help someone that has epilepsy versus someone that's trying to lose body fat?
Very good question. Yeah. I have to do a blog post on that, my keto nutrition blog post, because it is a question I get a lot, and I'm glad you asked it. Mm-hmm. So the ideal, I could tell you this so far, the ideal exogenous ketone formulation that is maximally neuroprotective for oxygen toxicity seizures is not the ideal formulation that will enhance exercise performance. Mm-hmm. It may increase it like just a smidge, maybe 5 or 10%, but there are other formulations that, at least in rodent models, can increase exercise performance up to 15 or 20%, maybe. Wow. So it may be that we take, the anti-seizure formula and we take the exercise formula and we blend them in specific ratios to give the best of both worlds. So that's kind of where we're at now. We do know that with with any kind of seizure, actually, any model of seizure we're studying, you have to elevate beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate more or less in a 1-to-1 ratio. And that gives profound anti-seizure effects. So, and that's a very unique formulation that requires, a bit of effort on the part of the chemist to do things, and a bit of the formulator to do things. So it's very clear at this point that different exogenous ketone and formulations of those ketones have different effects, whether it be epigenetic effects, anti-inflammatory effects, behavioral modification effects, changing redox biochemistry, anti-seizures, and the different things that we're studying, age-related, so cognitive decline, different types of disorders we're looking at now, like cancer. We think we don't know at this point in time. We're studying different exogenous ketone formulations, but we don't know what works best at minimizing the growth of cancer and also protecting against cancer cachexia. So one of my students, Andrew Kutnick, a PhD student, actually gave a recent TED Talk on his type 1 diabetes and managing it with low carb, actually. But he's studying muscle wasting, and we're basically trying to get insight into muscle wasting as it relates to cancer cachexia to design and optimize the optimal ketogenic strategy to mitigate that. And I think the information that comes out of there could be taken into the real world, because bodybuilders who are working out, strength athletes, are subjecting themselves to muscle wasting just by virtue of the high intensity training. Military personnel, maybe in austere environments, or subjecting their bodies to high physical demands, maybe at a catabolic state. So we're not necessarily trying to increase anabolic state, but we are trying to attenuate or abolish the catabolic state that is, really accelerated in things like cancer, metastatic cancer, and under different environmental situations.
Gotcha. So do you foresee, like in the future with exogenous ketones, there being specific formulas for specific protocols like seizures or anti-cancer or exercise performance?
Yeah, there has to be. Just like there's different diets, like that do that. Yeah, I view ketones as kind of like the fourth macronutrient.
Yeah.
And we're just at the cusp right now of learning how to use that macronutrient. Many people think I'm purely a keto guy, but
Yeah.
I think that like glucose and sugar is actually a performance enhancing compound, and it can be used. I believe it should be used sparingly. I think it can be used, to enhance exercise performance, to enhance your work in the gym. So can ketones, and ketones are kind of they have some unique properties that just go above and beyond their capacity as an exercise fuel. They have interesting signaling properties, neuroprotective properties. So we're trying to determine how to best formulate, what exogenous ketone may be optimal for particular situations, therapeutic versus performance, and how to formulate that and even incorporate that compound into a diet. So certain compounds may not work best with certain diets. So we're looking at a very modified form of a ketogenic diet, a standard diet from a rodent chow perspective. And then we're also doing some of the human studies, on the NASA mission, and just looking at, that diet and how that affects metabolism too. And ultimately how metabolism will change in the context of being in nutritional ketosis through exogenous ketone implementation.
Yeah. And so what are you finding when you take exogenous ketones, but also maybe like a performance enhancing glucose combination at the same time? Is there any new research with upping your ketones, but also upping glucose at the same time, or could that be dangerous?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's some data already out there in humans that are consuming a ketone ester, a monoester, beta hydroxybutyrate. We've been doing rodent studies where we administer the ketogenic agent in the context of a high carbohydrate diet or rodent chow diet. What we do see is that, and this is maybe one of the most interesting things with exogenous ketones, is that it dramatically lowers blood glucose. And it was actually part of the newsletter from, our website yesterday we launched, and we're really delving into that. As we say that the elevation of ketones is inversely proportional to blood glucose, which means that if you administer exogenous ketones in graded amounts, you'll see a very characteristic correlation and decrease in your blood glucose over time. So that could be due to a number of different things. At first, you're thinking that could be an increase in insulin.
Yeah. So
you take exogenous ketones, you spike insulin, it facilitates glucose disposal in peripheral tissues. But so far we don't really see an increase in insulin unless the dosages push the ketones up above 2 or 3 millimolar.
Wow.
And I've measured insulin in myself, drinking a lot of ketone ester and many other things, and it budges it only a little bit, and it's not even comparable to carbohydrates or even to protein. So if I eat protein, my insulin's going to elevate more than exogenous ketones. And some people think you throw exogenous ketones on, you spike insulin, there goes your fat burning.
Yeah.
No, that's actually not the case at all. The glucose, the lowering of glucose is not a result of, from my interpretation so far, is not a result of a ketone-induced release of insulin. It may be a small contributor, but it's more likely facilitating glucose disposal. And it's also decreasing hepatic glucose output.
Yeah.
So the glucose in your blood right now is actually a result of the liver regulating metabolic processes and regulating gluconeogenesis or glycogenolysis. And that process is a finely tuned, very elegant biochemical, series of reactions that are happening in your liver. When you throw ketones in there, I think of the liver like a brain. It's a very elegant organism that's actually tied to the neural control of autonomic regulation, is to some extent regulating the the liver's output of nutrients through sympathetic versus parasympathetic tone. It gets kind of complicated, but the release of glucose from the liver is attenuated greatly if blood ketones are elevated. Okay. And that's really important for type 2 diabetes. That's very important for appetite regulation. That's very important for maintaining homeostasis. And it's also very important for preventing a high glucose when there's a high ketones when you take the two together. If you take ketones and glucose together, the rise in glucose would be less than if you were to take the glucose alone.
Interesting. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, because obviously people that take exogenous ketones, they're usually doing it. Most people are probably doing it for athletic performance, but there's probably like some other therapeutic applications, like you mentioned. But I think it's really interesting because that's a question I get a lot as well. It's like, well, what if I eat donuts and have exogenous ketones? If you combine those two together, I guess what you're saying is the glucose response from the donut wouldn't be as high if you didn't take the ketones with it.
It's like, what if you eat donuts and what if you eat protein? What if you eat donuts and what if you take MCT? Yeah. So think of ketones as like a fourth macronutrient that you can elevate in the blood, but a unique property of it is that it actually helps to buffer or attenuate that postprandial spike in glucose that typically happens when you feed sugar.
Yeah.
And I will admit at this point in time, we don't fully understand the glucose lowering effects of exogenous ketones.
Yeah.
What we need to do for that is do a lot of metabolic physiology, but we also have to do metabolomic analysis of the liver itself.
Yeah.
So we do a fasted state, a fed state with and without exogenous ketones. We end the experiment at that point in time, which would be sacrificing the animal, and we take the liver, and then we do a metabolomic analysis of the liver state under those situations.
Gotcha. What do you think about the whole carnivore approach that's kind of becoming really popular these days?
Well, occasionally, I think many of these diets, including the ketogenic diet, they have their applications, but when it's done continuously, I'm a big believer in varying things over time. So I do today I'm intermittent fasting, but yesterday I had 3 solid meals throughout the day. I would say yesterday was a ketogenic diet day, but the day before that, it was just low carb because I had a lot of vegetables throughout the day. I had a little bit of fruit at night. I think it's good to mix it up. I think if you go on a strictly carnivore diet, there are phytonutrients that you're missing out on. Not only soluble fiber, which is, can help the gut microbiome, but insoluble fiber can help digestion, can help, elimination and things. I feel that some people go crazy on the fiber, and too much fiber on me, it just gets me bloated and gassy. Yeah. But I really do believe that some amount of soluble and probably more importantly, insoluble fiber is necessary in the diet. So just completely eating a steak every day, if that's, or a piece of liver or steak or whatever, I don't think that's optimal. It may be optimal for some people that are battling, for example, autoimmune disorders, but I think it's more important to look into why is that optimal? Like what things in your environment, So I think you have to adjust your diet to work for you, depending on your food preferences. If you like steak, then by all means, do it, but also carefully. And this doesn't get thrown around enough. I mean, you need to really do blood work, just a basic CBC, comprehensive metabolic panel, CMP, and do that. Ideally, I like to do it 4 times a year, but ideally you should do it once a year. Ideally 4 times a year, but at the very least, rather once a year or twice a year to understand what these diets are doing for your inflammation, for your hemoglobin H1C, for your liver function, kidney function, things like that. I think that's important. I know there's all the rage now, the carnivore diet, and I think it can be beneficial for a lot of people. And some days my meal pattern resembles that. I mean, some days I might go all day especially if I'm traveling, I don't eat all day. And I end up at a hotel and I just, I look at the menu and I just get like a ribeye steak and that's it. And usually I have some salad greens with it, but that pretty close to a carnivore diet.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to realize that what works for you today in this moment might not work for you tomorrow or the next day or 5 years from now. So being open to change and realize, and that's why it's important to do blood work to know, okay, hey, this works for me for a season. Maybe it's time to change it up and switch things up because 10 years ago, this, my blood was optimal, I was feeling good, but now I'm this, and I need to be open to change. I think that's where people struggle because they get so emotionally attached to these diets, and sometimes it almost becomes their religion where they become dogmatic about it. And they kind of, it's hard for people to let go of that because they've been so mentally focused on one type of diet. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I picked up a book 20 years ago, and it was called The Sardine Diet. And at the time, I didn't like sardines, but I thought I picked it up at a conference, I believe. And it was on my shelf for some time, and I picked it up and started reading it. And maybe 10 years after I picked up the book, which was about 10 years ago, because I picked it up about 20 years ago, I started eating sardines, and
Gotcha.
I love them. I mean, they're like a staple. I got a huge stash on the other side of my desk over there. But I would not, even though I love them and I think they're a nutritional powerhouse, I would not go on a sardine diet. You know what I mean? I think it's good to vary our foods to the extent that we're getting at least, if we go to the store, we should be buying at least 10 to 12 different foods. I mean, some people go crazy and buy like 50 foods, but I tend to be a creature of habit and just pick maybe about 10 to 12 foods, and they're the things that I buy each time.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, what do you think about keto for women specifically? Is there anything in particular that women need to be aware of, especially if they go long term with keto or just in general, keto for women?
Women's physiology is a little more reactionary, I would say, to changes in blood glucose levels and energy balance. So with that in mind, if you were to create a dietary energy restriction or to create a decrease in insulin signaling through carbohydrate restriction, that may cause some hormonal changes, especially initially in women. Many women, depending on where they're starting from, right?
Yeah.
So the issue I see it is that when a lot of women start the ketogenic diet, they use it for weight loss, and they're losing weight, and they have created a calorie deficit at the same time. It's a fantastic, well, it can be a great benefit of the ketogenic diet is that it helps to control your appetite. But if you're not getting enough calories, especially for women, that can impact their hormones, that can impact their thyroid, that can do. But if you consume a low carb diet, a ketogenic diet, and your calories are sufficient, and you actually do eat enough fat, which a lot of women are scared to do, that can be a healthy diet for a woman, but really needs to track. I would suggest tracking total blood work, CBC, CMP, look at thyroid, look at hormones, to determine how the diet is affecting. Because some people say, well, it's just a diet, but you are radically changing, especially if you're coming from a background of a high carbohydrate diet, you're radically changing your metabolic physiology when you're doing it. And it's important to understand, some of the changes. So not only objectively, but also subjectively, like, how do you feel? I've gotten a lot of women contact me and they're like, I'm doing the ketogenic diet. My blood work looks fantastic, but I feel awful. I just don't feel good. I feel a little bit dizzy, when I stand up. That's orthostatic hypotension. That could be mitigated with just some fluids and sodium and things like that. But they may, they feel fantastic, or they're excited about the health biomarkers that are improving, but they don't feel good. And I would say that's an equally important reason not to do the ketogenic diet, especially if it's after about 2 months of doing it. Because I really think 2 months is the bare minimum to really get some of the beneficial adaptations that you should be feeling at about that point in time. Personally, it took about 6 months for me to really, and there's a learning curve to the diet, so maybe I wasn't doing it completely well, but the more you do it, the easier it gets, the more benefits you derive from it over time.
Yeah.
And that's what I tell people. And you can see that typically in the blood work, typically in how I feel, and also in my performance in the gym, tends to improve, decrease, stabilize, and then improve over in that order from 1 month to second month to the third month.
Yeah. Gotcha. Can you go into the whole topic of cholesterol and how it works in the body, with specifically with ketosis? Because obviously that's a lot of people's concerns. And even when it comes to explaining this to doctors sometimes who still think, hey, your cholesterol is going to go up if you do keto. How do you explain the whole cholesterol thing to people?
Yeah, well, I had early conversations, actually even met Ron Krause, who is really, and I would encourage your listeners, maybe even have him on. I know he's a busy guy, but he was on Peter Attia's podcast, as was I, that he really delved into the weeds of cholesterol metabolism, essentially wrote the book and helped even develop some of the methodologies to measure cholesterol. So from a very superficial perspective, I can explain sort of maybe if I explain my personal experience, then we could approach it from that context, which I personally thought that maybe only 15 to 20% of people would have an elevation of LDL over time. That was me. That was my feeling kind of going into it, until mine really spiked high. I was on primarily a dairy-centric ketogenic diet in the beginning, meaning to get all the fat that was required to meet my calories, I was taking in a stick and a half of butter a day and maybe a pint of heavy cream a day. And I needed to put that aside. And it was like, okay, I need to consume all that. And then I would measure out my protein. So I started out doing the clinical ketogenic diet for, research purposes to understand it from that perspective.
Yeah.
And this is before everyone was doing, this is back in 2008, I think. And after doing that kind of diet for about a year or two and getting some blood work done, my cholesterol about tripled, my LDL cholesterol. And then I took out the heavy cream and added coconut cream and reduced my butter consumption, started using more monounsaturated fats. And my total cholesterol, my LDL came down a little bit, and my LDLP, my particle number was still pretty elevated over time, even 2 or 3 years into it. But I feel it's at a range now that's not dangerously high, and we don't understand, and I think Ron Krause would even say, we don't understand what these numbers mean in the context of a ketogenic diet, because all the data out there that's really looking at the atherogenic risk associated with these biomarkers are looking at it in the context primarily of a standard diet. So from my perspective, and I'm not a lipidologist, but from my nutrition background, my perspective is that with LDL, you need more little boats sort of carrying not only the cholesterol, but you're also carrying triglycerides, you're carrying phospholipids. The LDL molecule has a very important role. If you get injured, your LDL might spike because it plays a role in repair processes. If you are exercising or over-exercising, it may be elevated. A lot of different things can acutely and chronically affect your lipid profile, right? So from my perspective, I think people on a ketogenic diet will always run a little bit higher LDL, but I think it's more important that their triglyceride levels almost always go down. And if it doesn't go down, they're not a good fat metabolizer. And there's a lot of disorders that I study that are associated with fatty acid oxidation disorders. Like, there's a range of them, and that's something that ketones can actually have a therapeutic effect for. So, and it's a spectrum. It's not like you can't metabolize them or not metabolize them, but you may not metabolize them. You may have a 25% or 40% decrease in this enzymatic pathway that's preventing your triglycerides from going down. So you need to actually reduce fat in your diet for that particular person. But generally speaking, I think, at least 50% of the population would significantly benefit from going on a ketogenic diet, at least intermittently, once a year, twice a year, something like that, where they transition for a month or two and just to try it. But I would say do blood work before and after, and you'll probably find that if you do the ketogenic diet and transition off of it, and you're doing it for body composition purposes, things like that, to get your weight where you want it to be, the next time you do the ketogenic diet, it will be easier. And we don't know the science behind it, but I think of it like muscle memory. If you work up to a 500 or 600 pound deadlift, right, and then you stop working out, and then you go back to it again, it's not like it's going to take you 5 to 10 years to get there again. You could probably do it in 5 weeks, like your ketone levels up, and once you've turned on the metabolic machinery that allows you to burn that amount of fat and create ketones, and then you stop. If you go back to that, you get into that state quickly. And there's some animal data. It's not yet published, and I can't talk about it, but we kind of see that in various model systems, that when you create a state of nutritional ketosis, completely stop, and then take some time off and then go back into it again, the keto adaptation phase is very rapid.
Gotcha.
And that has this is basic science, laboratory stuff I'm talking about, but this has very practical implications for the general population. I'm not a huge fan of the cyclic ketogenic diet when it's done on a weekly basis. Some people may do that. I just tend not to do that. But I do think the ketogenic diet should be sustained over a period of time to force those adaptations. And once those adaptations are made, then you are really changing your metabolism, and you can have some long-term benefits from that.
Gotcha.
If it's done just even periodically.
Yeah. And what do you think about going keto long-term? Does your body ever lose its ability to metabolize carbohydrates efficiently if you never have carbohydrates, let's say, for 5, 10, 15 years? Does your body lose its ability to metabolize carbohydrates, maybe more inefficiently if you do keto long-term?
What I'm going to say may upset some people, but I say yes at long term. Well, let me just say this. You need to define long term.
Sure,
okay, I'll say this. So if you go on a ketogenic diet for 1 year, so Lane Norton, which is a good friend of mine, a lot of people think that we have different opinions. He actually, in his book, he's got this is a fantastic book right here. So this is actually Lane's book, and it talks about flexible dieting, and it's actually the book I recommend for people. And he considers the ketogenic diet a tool in the toolbox, and we'll be talking about that on Joe Rogan in 2 weeks.
Coming up, right? It's coming up,
right? In that book, he has an analogy about a factory, right? If the factory is building airplanes, right, and then the factory changes their contract to where they start building ships, right? You need to basically replace a lot of, maybe some of the engineers, some of the building materials and things like that, to switch over from a plane building, an aircraft building factory, to a ship building factory. Sort of the same thing kind of takes place with your metabolism. Now, if that factory goes from building airplanes to building ships, it may take a year for that factory to be churning out, the optimal amount of ships, right? And then it gets another contract to go build airplanes again, has a lot of that machinery and that expertise to build airplanes, so could rapidly, instead of a year to get, it could go back within a month and start building, ships or airplanes at a rapid rate. So I think that analogy I like that analogy because I think the same thing happens with your body. Your body's, used to burning carbohydrates. If you transition, I think it may be a little bit difficult because we've trained our bodies through modern, eating strategies and eating 4 to 6 meals a day, which a lot of people do. We've trained our bodies to be dependent on glucose and carbohydrates. So when we stop and force it to burn fat, that causes things like mitochondrial biogenesis. It actually forces your metabolic machinery to change fundamentally. So if you go back to eating carbohydrates, there will be a lag time. There will be a deficiency in the glucose transporters, probably. You may have the glycolytic pathways may need months to basically ramp up their activity, the glycolytic enzymes, the transport systems, and even your hormones may need to adjust, insulin signaling and things like that. But it will be much more rapid than the 1 year that you were on the ketogenic diet. So I think that's and the same thing happens like if you are a fitness competitor and you have a show where you're going to be on stage or whatever, and it takes you 12 weeks to diet for that show, you need to have a pretty severe, if you're overweight, a pretty severe caloric restriction during that 12 weeks, because that's really not a lot of time. I would say it takes an equal amount of time, another 12 weeks, to get your metabolism back up. It's not like you diet, you run a 500 calorie deficit every day for a showtime, and then within, the next day, your metabolism's up and you can go back to your baseline metabolism. It really takes, if you look at your metabolism, almost an equal amount of time to recover from that. And that's kind of missed by a lot of people. So that would be like reverse dieting. I think Lane talks about it in his book. So a lot of people don't understand that you need to methodically sort of titrate your calories back in to accommodate the metabolic, some people call it metabolic damage. I call it metabolic adaptation over time. Your body's a more efficient machine in using the macromolecules that you're giving it. So it takes a while to come back. Kind of the same thing happens with, fat and carbohydrates too.
So at the end of the day, it's important for people to just be patient with their bodies as their body transitions, because a lot of people fear, if I go keto, the second I touch a carbohydrate, I'm going to explode and just like blow up in size and weight again and weight gain. So I think that's the fear that people have, and so that's why I wanted to ask that question. But just from what I'm hearing from you is like, hey, give your body time to adjust and adapt to whatever, if you're going keto, there's an adaptation period, right? It's a transitionary period where it takes a while to get used to using ketones efficiently. And then if you go long-term keto and you come back, there might be another transitionary period as well. So that's great information for a lot of people. Really quick, since we're running out of time, the Metabolic Health Summit coming up in January. Can you talk to us about what that entails and when it is and all the details about the Metabolic Health Summit?
It's the very last week in January. I got to look at the dates now. I should know it offhand. But like January 30th to February 2nd or 3rd. So block out those dates, please, because there is so much to be experienced at this event. It's an amazing synergy of clinical science, which is great because there's continuing medical education credits. There's education credits for registered dietitians too. So it's a great synergy between the practical clinical science and the basic kind of PhD level science, but also the everyday person who just wants to understand keto. There's going to be influencers there. You're going to be there for sure. There's going to be some big personalities there. Some heavy hitters in the field are going to be there to interact with. So it's going to be a great synergy of, clinic, basic science, influencers, and workshops that teach how to implement the ketogenic diet as a lifestyle.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. There's also going to be one of the things that I think is super important is for companies that are in this space or even peripherally associated with this space are going to be at the event. So if you're an entrepreneur, if you're looking to invest in this space, if you're looking to maybe start a company to understand who the players are in the field, you're gonna miss out if you're not at this event. If you're in a food company, supplement company, if you have an app that's, can help assist people in this company, please come to this event because it's going to be you're going to miss out on it if you're not there. So I want to allocate, I think I'm giving a talk too, but I want to make sure that our speakers too have face-to-face time with the attendees.
Awesome.
So there's going to be networking events where I'm going to make myself available to answer questions to the audience. We're going to have panel discussions where the experts are up there and answering questions of the audience. We really want to cater to the audience in this and actually create an environment where, depending on if you're a medical doctor, a PhD scientist, a student, an entrepreneur, an investor, or just wanting to know the space, that you're going to be able to get everything out of this conference.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Entertainment too.
Yeah.
So I forgot to add, I'm not working on that, but Dr. Angela Poff and Victoria are working to make this event an amazing entertainment experience on top of that. I mean, they've been working really hard, and the venue is amazing. It's convenient. There are so many perks to this venue. They've looked at, I think, dozens of venues before picking this ideal location.
Yeah, and I have no doubt that it's going to be amazing because I know Victoria, I know Dr. Angela Poff, and I know you, and I know the three of you, and everyone else that's involved in it is going to make it an awesome event. That's why I'm looking forward to it. I think it's January. Actually, I don't want to throw the dates out there because I don't know either, but it's in January. Go
to the Metabolic Health Summit website. If you just put that in on Google. Also go to Keto. I got to plug my website, ketonutrition.org, and the link on there will take you to the Metabolic Health Summit. And also ketonutrition.org has a lot of information on things that we talked about, on this podcast too. So it's more of an informational website.
Gotcha. Yeah, we'll put all the links in the show notes below. But really quick before you go, I know you're going on Joe Rogan with Dr. Lane Norton, who I've actually had on my podcast. He's actually a good dude. And a lot of people don't know that you guys are actually, go back 10 years. You've been friends for a while. So it's not going to be this debate where you guys hate each other. Like, people are probably setting it up on social media. But really excited about that. And since we're speaking of Joe Rogan, I just have to ask, because a lot of people ask me as well, when it comes to marijuana. Is marijuana keto friendly?
That's a good question. The meeting I have right after I get off of this, after talking with you, is actually meeting with a company that markets CBD. Okay. So we are looking at the effects of CBD and ketones potentially. Huh. So I tried to do this research. Long story, like a couple years ago. And the university made it very difficult for me to do any kind of, but now, because I think the universities see that there's a lot of money and that it's very legitimate, the science supporting the therapeutic effects of marijuana, CBD is what we're going to be studying, is very legit. So it's an interest. I'm approaching it kind of cautiously just because I have to be conservative in an academic institution. Yeah. But I'm excited to sort of do some research on this front. And that's kind of the next frontier. I don't know if it'll come up in Joe Rogan, but in regards to the anti-seizure effects and the anti-cancer effects, that's what we want to focus on from my perspective. Yeah. But I know there may be some health benefits on top of that. That's pretty cool, though, that you had Lane Norton on your podcast. I'll have to go listen to that. I did listen to just in preparing for this, in my drive here, I listened to Ben Greenfield, which was an awesome podcast. Yeah. And Benjamin Hardy. I think it was one of Hardy. Yeah. So everybody listening right now, go listen to that podcast because it was a fantastic podcast. And and it talked about the environmental influence, or the environment that you put yourself in. It resonated with me on many levels. I thought it was a great podcast.
And the book is remarkable too. Willpower Doesn't Work, which is right up my alley of me trying to help people transform. We think we just have to willpower our way through it, and so I appreciate you listening to that, because it's like basically that's why it resonated with me. Helping people change their environment, adapt to that new environment, and that's how you change your life. And so, anyways, really appreciate that, and really appreciate your time, Dr. Dom. Really appreciate you coming on here. Have fun with Layne Norton and Joe Rogan. I know you're going to have a blast out there, as always, because you've been on his podcast before. So
yeah, it's fun.
And keep doing what you're doing, man. I really appreciate you with the work that you do. I know you're at the forefront of really transforming people's lives. So we thank you for all that you do for so many people.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate you giving me this platform to talk about my stuff. And I really appreciate, all the great information that you put out there, and getting the word out too. We owe a lot to the podcasters, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think they are really helping us as scientists. We wouldn't really be getting this message out, but I have major people at very high levels that only heard about this, not because of the scientific literature, but they hear podcasts on this, and they just happen to, and that's the reason why, and that almost can steer policy. You can actually impact policy making decisions with some of the content you're putting out there. So I thank you for that.
Okay.
Thanks again for having me on.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Dom. We'll see you next time.